Good afternoon. Welcome to Lunch with Books. My name is Sean Duffy. I am the host of the program, and I'm going to introduce our guest today. Scott Mingus is a scientist and consultant in the global pulp and paper industry and holds patents in self-adhesive postage stamps and barcode labels. He's written numerous Civil War and Underground Railroad books. Some of them were award-winning books. And he's from York, Pennsylvania. So here is Scott Mingus.
Thanks, Sean. I appreciate the. Sean mentioned, I am Scott Mingus. I'm a native of southeastern Ohio. Obviously, spent a lot of time in the Ohio River Valley during my time. Had my undergraduate degree in pulp paper science and engineering from Miami University in Oxford, Ohio. So I've been in the paper industry for my entire career as a scientist, then as a leader of scientific groups, and then finally as a senior executive in charge of the scientific functions for an international paper company headquartered here in York, Pennsylvania. What we want to do today is give a brief overview of the history of papermaking and especially talk about the impact of papermaking in the mid-1800s here in the Ohio River Valley. So with that, let me go ahead and share my screen and we will get started. Okay, we want to talk about how papermaking came to the Ohio River Valley. As mentioned, I'm a market consultant for the paper industry, and we want to understand just exactly what was going on with papermaking. As you can see on the first slide, communication created the need for papermaking. Early civilization, as languages were invented and methods of communication, laws were starting to be developed, contracts, business records, things like that. And mankind wanted some way of memorializing these events, writing them down so there was a written record, so there just simply wasn't he said, she said. So obviously a lot of different things were developed in the early days, such as cuneiform writing, written communications as well, putting them down in clay tablets, brick tablets, things along those lines. As civilization continued to grow and more records were being established, the need to store those records and have them be more transportable and more communicable became important. So in the early 4000 BC era, the Egyptians began to develop papyrus. They took reeds from along the Nile River, beat them with rocks or with wooden mallets, and formed them into a pulpy consistency, which they allowed to air dry. They called this substance papyrus. And as you can see in the photograph, you'll see a picture of some of the papyri, with, again, the Egyptian drawings. Over time, in other climates where reeds weren't popular, they certainly had plenty of animals, and so as part of the tanning operation, animal parchment was developed as a medium for writing. Those were the skins of donkeys and goats and sheep,
Hey, Scott.
Cattle, things along those lines. Lambs and go ahead.
The screen share isn't working. We need to.
The screen share is not working. Let's try it again. All right. Thanks for letting me know, Sean. How's it working?
I still don't see it.
Okay, we've got a technical issue. Let's try that.
There we go.
There we go. Okay, so let's step back. We talked about the initial need for communications here in the early days of the British Empire, or the early days of the Egyptian Empire. Sean, can you still see the screen now?
Yes, I can see it now.
Perfect. Okay. So again, animal parchment became one of the key ways of developing the method of portable, transportable, and very lightweight and storable methods of communication. The finest grades in the early days of the medieval era, if you will, and the early era was vellum, which happened to come from young lambs and calves. And these were the really major ways of communicating for much of the BC era. Finally, in China, in 105 AD, a guy named Cai Lun developed what we would today traditionally call paper. So those of us who are veterans of the paper industry will recognize Cai Lun as the inventor of our industry, if you will. He mixed mulberry bark, hemp, which is similar to rope fiber or jute or sisal. He would also take cloth rags, old fishing nets that had been discarded, whatever had a fiber. He would mix that with water after beating it. Then he would take the suspension, form it into a sheet, strain out as much of the water as he could, squeeze out the rest, and then hang up these sheets of paper, if you will, to air dry. These became incredibly inexpensive, easy to produce, although quite labor intensive, but it was far more cheap to produce than a silk or bamboo or some of the other things the Chinese were using for documents. So for the next 700 years, until in fact the 800 AD period, the Chinese dominated papermaking and they kept it as an imperial royal secret. In fact, anyone that revealed the secrets of papermaking was to be executed and immediately put to death because the Chinese consider this to be their technical invention and their advantage for their culture. However, in the year 751, Arab warriors began capturing Chinese papermakers in a battle, took some of these papermakers back to the Middle East with them, and over time, from about 800 till about 1100 or so, papermaking began to grow in the Middle East in particular. And then it spread into North Africa and Morocco in particular. 1151, the Moors built the first paper mill in Europe, crossing the Mediterranean Sea and establishing a mill in Spain. Very quickly throughout Europe, paper industry continued to spread. You can see in the little chart below that it spread to France and England, Germany, Russia, Norway, Scandinavia. And so by the middle 1500s, paper industry was very well established throughout Europe. One of the things that really drove that was in 1450 was the development of the Gutenberg printing press. That, of course, revolutionized the need for Bibles and broadsides and announcements and books and all kinds of other materials. But paper throughout the Middle Ages, throughout the 14, 15, 16, 1700s, was still handmade. In fact, it took two craftsmen, a vatman and what was called a couchman, to actually produce paper. You can see in the picture on the screen, the vatman is dipping a wire screen into a vat filled with a slurry made out of pulp and water. These screens would be, if they were 17 by 22, they called that a bond screen. Newsprint screens were 24 by 36. Book screens were 25 by 38. That over time gave rise to what's known as the basis weight of paper. So when you go into your local Staples or office store and you look for 20-pound bond paper or 17-pound bond paper, 24-pound paper, things like that, those were originally, in the old days, would have been produced on a 17 by 22 screen. Although they're now no longer made on static screens of that size, that terminology has continued over the years. So paper making was an art. It was passed down from generation to generation. So you would have many people that were third, fourth, fifth, all the way to eighth and ninth generation paper makers in Western Europe. Finally, with the advent of British North America, paper making finally crossed the Atlantic River. In 1690, the fellow who's pictured there, the rather stern-looking fellow, is William Rittenhouse. William Rittenhouse lived outside of Philadelphia in southeastern Pennsylvania in a little village called Germantown. He took local flax and linen fibers that he collected from rags. He would actually put the rags in giant vats, would rip them apart with hammer mills, and would separate the individual flax and linen fibers. He would also go around to the different textile mills that were in the area, and he would again get the cotton or flax or linen fibers from these textile facilities that were making clothing and blankets, things along those lines. He also was developing a very thin, lightweight grade of paper they became widely used in colonial North America for Bible and religious paper. And of course, some of you are familiar with American Revolution history, know that James Watt and a number of other people got involved in using Bible paper as wadding for colonial muskets during the American Revolution. A lot of that, of course, was produced by the Rittenhouse Mill. So the Rittenhouse facility is not the first mill in North America. It was the first one in British North America. Actually, in 1567, the Spanish had created a mill in Mexico during their conquest of the Aztecs and moving on from there. But the mills in North America quickly became known for incredibly high quality. In the early days, most colonists had to bring paper over from England or Germany. Now they're able to produce it locally. Rittenhouse would train his son-in-law and other men to start making paper, and the industry expanded again, starting in the Middle Atlantic region in Delaware, Maryland, Pennsylvania in the 1700s. 1729, a fellow by the name of Thomas Wilcox started the paper mill you see on the screen, the Ivy Mill. That is the mill that produced the paper for Ben Franklin. So as Franklin was producing Poor Richard's Almanac and Franklin's various newspapers, his early insurance papers from the insurance companies, the fire companies, etc., all of that paper came from the Ivy Mills in Chester. By 1770, right before the American Revolution, there were 12 different paper mills in southeastern Pennsylvania and a number of smaller mills in Delaware, all producing paper. As the colonists continued to move west out of Philadelphia and New York, Massachusetts, moving into upstate New York, moving west through Pennsylvania, the first paper mill was established west of the Appalachian Mountains in 1796. That was in Fayette County, Pennsylvania. It was called the Redstone Mill. Again, very small mill. By 1806, just 10 years later, paper making had come to the Ohio River Valley. And the first mill, in fact, in what was the new state of Ohio, was put up in 1806 in Columbiana County, obviously somewhat northwest of Wheeling. The image on the screen shows King's Mill. This was actually the first paper mill established west of the Susquehanna River here in York, Pennsylvania, where I now currently live. What started driving the need for paper was twofold. Number one, as immigrants continue to move west into the wilderness and head towards places like Pittsburgh and Wheeling, later to Columbus, places like that in the Ohio country, they wrote letters home. And so there was a demand for paper. Obviously, they did not want to bring paper with them and then have to write on it and ship it back to the East Coast. So there became a demand for local paper as these communities got bigger. And as the towns continued to grow, most of them began establishing newspapers. And it was really the newspapers that started the big demand for paper. And the third factor that came into play was butcher paper, wrapping paper, things like that for preserving parcels. Now, to put a paper mill in place, there are two key things you need. Number one is water, or some sort of a power source. Water, of course, in the Ohio River was quite plentiful. Wheeling Creek could be dammed as it was for flour mills. So Wheeling area became a prime place for paper making. And of course, the other key thing was the consistent supply of rags, since most paper was still being manufactured of rags or straw at that point in time. So those were needed. What you see on the screen is a Wheeling repository that was founded 1807, one of the first newspapers, of course, in the Ohio River Valley. Again, that drove the need for additional paper. As towns got bigger and the demand for paper got larger across the world, especially, there became a need to automate. Up until this point in the history of the world, all paper was produced by hand. Again, as you see in the picture with the gentleman with the vat of paper and the wire screens that he's going to dip into the vat of fibers and create the sheet of paper. That simply was way too slow and could not produce nearly enough paper to manufacture what the industry needed. So beginning in the late 1790s through the early 1800s, tremendous amount of research was being done, particularly in Germany and Britain, to develop automated machines that would actually produce paper. 1799, French engineer Louis Nicolas Robert developed the very first patentable continuous paper machine. So if you look on the right of the picture, you'll see in 1820, one of the early Robert type machines. Instead of using a vat of fiber containing water, the fiber containing water was actually added to the machine. The wire moved as a screen on a series of pullers and levies, and the water would drain out of the sheet, and the dry, semi-dry sheets of paper would come off the back end. The Fourdrinier brothers, Henry and Seeley Fourdrinier, are considered to be the fathers of modern American papermaking. They took the original Robert design and another design by a Briton by the name of Conklin and turned it into what we now know as modern papermaking. So that really spurred the growth. So by 1810, we have 200 paper mills throughout the United States. Again, Pennsylvania being the #1 paper-making state in the country at that point in time with well over 75 mills. But all of that was still handmade. The first Fourdrinier paper machine to be put on a boat and sent to the United States arrived in 1817 and was put to use in Wilmington, Delaware. So there were two basic types of paper machines that are going to become important for our discussion of the Wheeling area. The first, of course, is the Fourdrinier. That's the machine we talked about earlier. That was the first automated machine. That would find widespread use for developing lightweight sheets of paper, again, such as Bible paper, wrapping papers, things like that. The second type, as you see on the bottom, developed by a fellow by the name of John Dickinson in England, is called a cylinder machine, where paper is produced in layers, if you will, almost like plies of cardboard, if you will. But in these days, or a tissue, Kleenex tissue is probably a better example, which would be, again, multi-ply stock, and cylinder machines were developed. It was the cylinder machines is what got paper making started in the Wheeling area. So if we take a quick look at moving from the national front specifically to what was going on in the Ohio River Valley. 1826, the fellow you see on the screen, William McKendrick Landon, built what became known as the Virginia Paper Mill. Now, his first mill lasted for 10 years. It was in what was then called South Wheeling, now, of course, Center City, along what's now 23rd Street. In 1835, he installed the first paper machine in what became West Virginia. When he built a cylinder machine, had it up and running, he was making wrapping papers, particularly butcher wrap in particular, early on. 1836, his mill was consumed by fire, but at the same time, another fellow was taking an old cotton factory at 49 Water Street, which Lambda was interested in, so he purchased that facility and turned it into a second paper mill. At the same time, he's rebuilding the Virginia paper mill and trying to get it back in operation. The Virginia mill, which became the first early and most important mill in the pre-Civil War history of Wheeling, used two steam engines to power the mill. So it would bring in, again, water from Wheeling Creek or from the river, depending on what time in its history it was. At its peak, this mill before the Civil War was producing $50,000 worth of paper a year. That was a lot of paper. It made Landon fairly wealthy. He employed 30 men, mostly young men, teenagers in many cases. He was the largest consumer of coal for many years in the Wheeling area. He had barge loads of coal brought to the paper mill front. Lambda and his sons also owned a dry goods and a grocery store over also on Water Street. His mill's at 49 Water Street. His grocery store is just right down the road at 117 Water Street. So Lambda becomes the first prolific mass producer of paper in the Wheeling area. He's producing it again mostly for butcher and other wrapping applications. He does do some newsprint, but it's really more driven for the local mercantile applications. And within short order of Lambden's mill, a number of other men start building paper mills. The two most prominent in the 1830s and 40s were the Wheeling Mill and the Phoenix Mill. You see an ad there from the Pittsburgh Gazette in 1834 for the Wheeling Mill as its founded Cook and Scheuer founding that mill. And again, you can see they were producing very heavy sheets of paper. Where again, the paper mills that were previously in the region were producing lighter weight wrapping papers, things along those lines. As paper mills today are different from one another, such has always been the case. So a paper mill producing very lightweight paper typically cannot do very heavyweight, vice versa, same as the mills today. So you had a need for multiple types of paper mills in these various facilities. And of course, the Wheeling area was a prime location. 1843, the Wheeling mills got some new competition. Right across the river, the Wagner brothers, who were two Pennsylvanians who had worked in paper mills in Pennsylvania and actually in Maryland for a time, came west. They ran out of money when they crossed the Ohio River and got to Bridgeport and decided that they needed to stop there and try to figure out how to raise some money. Turned out they were going to stay in Bridgeport for most of the rest of their lives. They got family members, friends, business acquaintances, people in the streets of Bridgeport even to donate money to them. And they ended up building a paper mill at 1503 Main Street with a side facility on South Street. They employed 15 people. They made 4,000 pounds of paper a day, making it the largest paper mill in eastern Ohio. Or in the Ohio River Valley at their peak. They made a lot of specialty and industrial papers. So they would make papers that would be used for, one of the things they did, for example, was greaseproof papers, glassine papers, as they were called. They were semi-transparent. People could use them as a low-cost replacement for expensive glass to allow light into facilities. So you began to see people using paper as window glazing. David Wagner took full control of the paper company when his brother died in 1848. He ran the mill until 1856 when he resigned to become the deputy sheriff of Belmont County. Don't forget David Wagner's name. He's going to come back in our story in a few minutes. We have not seen the last of this guy. William Landon, who of course was Wheeling's largest paper maker at the time, had a real period of if you will, doubt and a need to reinvent himself. His wife died in 1848. Landon decided to go west, like so many other men did, and joined the California Gold Rush, left his sons behind, keep the paper mill going. His sons, with William Landon temporarily out of the picture, brought in two new partners, Robert Bonham and F.W. Bassett. Bassett, another guy we're going to come back to, retired in only 2 years, and Bonham and the Lambda boys ended up buying all three paper mills that at the time existed in Wheeling. So you had the Virginia Mill, which was the original Lambda Mill on Water Street. You had the Wheeling Mill off of 2nd Street and the Phoenix Paper Mill, were all now owned by the firm of Lambda, Bonham and Company. And you can see in the bottom of this advertisement from the Wheeling Intelligencer, they made wrapping paper, candle paper, cotton yarn paper, steamboat paper, bonnet boards for the new bonnets the ladies were really wanting to do. Bonnet board, of course, made them stiff, and they also were involved in a number of other industrial and consumer grades. The Intelligencer, which had been established in 1852, became the first daily newspaper in the town. That, of course, greatly expanded the local need for newsprint and came to the point where it almost needed a full-time paper mill just to produce paper for the Intelligencer and other newspapers in the Wheeling area. While this was going on, paper mills were a very dangerous place. The newspapers of the 1840s, 50s, and 60s, unfortunately, are filled with articles about people who die as workers in paper mills, get their hands caught in nips, they fall into vats, rollers crush them, etc. Here's a sad story from the Intelligencer in 1853. a little girl whose dad worked at the mill for some reason is playing in the yard of the paper mill. Now, you fathers who work in mills today, you probably don't want to bring your daughters in their petticoats to your mill, but this man, for some reason, had his daughter there. She got stuck in the equipment and almost died. Luckily, people heard her cries and were able to get her out before she perished. There were a number of workers in the mills that unfortunately were not able to be saved, and there were more than a dozen paper mill workers die in West Virginia, Ohio, and Western Pennsylvania in the 1840s and 50s. Well, I mentioned that the Intelligencer required newsprint. The three paper mills in Wheeling did not produce a lot of newsprint. They were producing, as I showed you in the earlier advertisement, a number of other grades. Alexander Armstrong, who was one of the bigwigs in the newspaper community in the Ohio River Valley, built his own paper mill east of Wheeling, where Wheeling Creek passes what is now the Fulton neighborhood, then a small independent village. He built two 250-gallon a minute wells, damming up water from the Wheeling Creek. In 1854, in his own newspaper, he started buying rags, advertising for people to bring rags to his office so he could turn them back into paper. This happens to, the image on the screen now happens to become from 1886, but it shows the location of the paper mill, then known as the Hannah and Clemens paper mill, but previously, as mentioned, known as the Eagle Mill or known as Fulton Paper. Throughout much of its history, if you said the term Fulton Paper Mill, most West Virginians, people in Western Pennsylvania, Eastern Ohio would have known where this mill was through the Civil War into the Victorian era. The Fulton Paper Mill, along with the other paper mills in Wheeling area, suspended operations. Wheeling, for some reason, just never really caught on as a center of papermaking. Although there were plenty of mills there, they just simply weren't that profitable. And so all four mills, the Phoenix Mill, Virginia Mill, Wheeling Mills, owned by Lambda and Bonham and Company, and the Fulton Mill, owned, of course, by the Armstrongs, all suspended operations. January 1858, the White Knight finally arrived in the form of John Davis. Davis bought all four paper mills. Again, you see the ad from the Intelligencer, and again started supplying locally produced paper and got all four mills off the ground. Now, none of the four mills were really making tremendous amounts of money. And again, the period of time from 1854 through 1870 is a period marked with just repeated new owners of these mills. For example, in 1858, Daniel C. Cushing buys the Wheeling Mill from and the Phoenix Paper Mill as well. Now, the only thing that saved these mills was there was a major fire up in Steubenville at the largest paper mill in that area, and that drove some business back to the Wheeling area, at least temporarily. The Eagle Mill, Fulton Mill, was renamed briefly the Star Paper Mill. That doesn't last very long. And then F.W. Bassett reemerges in the picture. Bassett had been one of the original partners, you may recall, in what became the William Landon and Sons Company. And so you can see in 1858, he leases the Virginia and Fulton mills and tries to restart them with John Davis still as the owner. And again, starts asking cash for rags. As the Civil War begins, Bassett's mills are still producing paper for the operations, but again, he can't make a go of it. So in March of 1863, about 4 months or so, 3 months before the Battle of Gettysburg, once again, a new owner emerges for the paper mills in Wheeling. Virginia and Fulton mills are brought back into operation. Phoenix Mill is pretty much done by that point in time, as is the mill across the river in Belmont County. In 1863, the Fulton Mill is sold. The mill is torn down. A brand new paper mill is actually built by new investors, including Armstrong. Again, the newspaper guy, gets back in the picture, and he ends up building a 72-inch Ford Rainier, the first Ford Rainier to arrive in the valley, and it gives him the ability to produce newsprint very efficiently at very low cost. And that's going to ensure the survival of the Fulton mill for many, many years. However, a year later, the Phoenix mill sold. That mill will disappear and go out of history. 1866, the Fulton mill starts making a new rage, TFilter papers. Americans wanted to filter their tea. That was something that had started in Great Britain and Germany. In fact, the company that I spent the last 17 years of my career working for, P.H. Gladfeller in York, Pennsylvania, owned mills in Germany and England, still does, in fact, that are the two world leading mills making tea bag paper even today. And it was those operations that taught the rest of the world how to make tea filter paper. And as you can see, tea paper briefly came into play in the Fulton mill, where Armstrong tried to move away from newsprint and try to make something different. In 1867, the Virginia mill, which by then had closed in downtown Wheeling on Water Street, comes back in the news. The Intelligencer calls it a considerable elephant, quicksand of which every man who undertook to run it sunk all the money he had and soon sunk himself hopelessly in debt. Daniel Cushing, who was one of the investors before the war, came back into the picture, bought the Virginia paper mill, put in a brand new straw pulping facility, and started making things. However, his mill only lasted for 5 years, and then down it went again in March of 1874. Came back up after a fire, but was struggling to make facility, and finally, by 1879 or so, the Virginia mill closed, leaving the Wheeling area with only 2 paper mills. The Fulton mill, of course, on the northeast side, which at that point in time was still turning rags into paper. They had abandoned the brief foray into tea filters. And of course, across the river, the mill that was making the money, the Buckeye mill, which was still producing a lot of specialty grades. This happens to be in 1881. Lockwood's Directory is the, if you will, the Bible for the paper industry. It lists every mill in every state and country. The directory still exists. I've used it heavily in my career. 1881, it shows Wheeling with its remaining 2 mills, the Fulton mill, then underneath the proprietorship of A.G. Robinson, with its Fourdrinier machine producing newspapers, again for the Intelligencer and almost every other newspaper in the valley. And of course, here's David Wagner, who's now come back into the picture, former Ohio State Senator from Belmont County, has purchased the Buckeye mill and continues to run its cylinder machine to manufacture greaseproof papers and all kinds of other facilities. One of the things that Wagner jumps into very quickly is industrial paper making. In the post-Civil War era, tar paper becomes incredibly popular, partially because as asphalt shingles were becoming more and more in use. The need for some sort of the sheathing underneath to protect the pine wood roofs from the chemicals used in asphalt became important. And so tar paper was developed and invented. It was actually developed here in York, Pennsylvania originally, and moved west into western Pennsylvania, Ohio, etc. And the first mill in Ohio and in the Ohio River Valley to make tar paper was, of course, David Wagner's Buckeye Mill. Became the leading producer, in fact, over the tri-state area, and for a number of years, that was one of the major products. In fact, you can see an ad here again from 1879 from the Industries of Wheeling, shows Buckeye paper mills, of course, that's the one across the river in Belmont, making wrapping papers, industrial roofing that we just talked about, printing paper, glass, and carpet paper. So it's all industrial applications. And he's doing quite well trying to do that while across the river in Wheeling, actually in Fulton, the other paper mills still continuing to churn out newsprint for the Intelligencer. One of the things that the Buckeye mill is producing is box board. And so a number of companies, in fact, this is Steinert Box Company. And of course, Sean, I thank you and the folks in the Ohio County Library for making this ad available. This happens to be one of several box makers that sprang up in downtown Wheeling, taking these pasteboard, if you will, from the Buckeye mill and from other suppliers, and producing them, forming them into hat boxes, into all kinds of carton boards that could be printed via lithography. And so this would again drive the business from the Buckeye mill. The Fulton mill, however, has got a short future. Hannah and Clements had bought the mill in 1879. Again, as mentioned, they keep trying to make newsprint. They finally invent a new product called Leatherwood, which is imitation fake leather. It's a product that's actually still made today by another company, still using the original technology basics that were developed in Fulton back in the 1880s. Leatherwood is now made in upstate New York. But the mill in Wheeling during the last few years of its time produced Leatherwood and shipped it as far away as Minnesota. But by 1896-97 timeframe, all the production had been moved to other more modern paper mills, and the Fulton mill closed, leaving the Buckeye mill as the last remaining mill in the Ohio River Valley. But it wasn't the last mill in West Virginia. Papermaking actually shifted south out of Wheeling into the rest of West Virginia. Harper's Ferry had always been a fairly significant papermaking operation, but a guy named William Luke shows up on the scene and builds a paper mill in Piedmont, West Virginia. Calls it Piedmont Paper. He merges it with a pulping company in Davis, West Virginia in the 1880s and forms what becomes the largest paper company in the history of West Virginia, known as the West Virginia Pulp and Paper Company, or as most of us know this company throughout much of its history as Westvaco. Their paper mill in Luke, which of course has sprawled both sides of the border from Luke, Maryland into West Virginia, finally closed in 2009, putting 700 paper makers out of work. That leaves Halltown Paper in Halltown, part of Ox Industries, as now the oldest remaining paper mill in West Virginia. So hopefully in the last 30, 35 minutes, we've had a quick overview of paper making in the Wheeling region, paper making and specialty mills that exist throughout the state. With that, I appreciate everyone taking the time today to listen and to look at the slides. The scene, of course, shows Water Street, where the original Virginia paper mill building was located. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to let Sean or I know. And with that, I will turn it back over to Sean for any further commentary.
Hi, Scott. I think we're waiting to see if anybody has any questions.
Yeah, I know that was kind of a whirlwind tour, but I want to give people at least a quick overview. I do want to acknowledge the work of John Bowman. John is a resident historian in the Wheeling area, has a nice website that has pictures of the Leatherwood product in particular, which was what the Fulton Mill became known for towards the end of its day. But John's early pioneering work certainly needs to be acknowledged. He did a lot of the major work on understanding the paper mills in the Wheeling area.
Yeah, thanks for bringing that up. And I was glad to hear you mention Leatherwood, because I know that's one of John's areas, and thanks for acknowledging him. And thanks a lot for focusing on Wheeling. I didn't expect that much, but everyone.
Yeah, it's a real. I said it was a key area. I mean, paper making obviously today is a highly specialized world. Half the paper makers in the United States have lost their jobs in the last 15 years as the industry has went more and more paperless. It's kind of a dying art. In fact, Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, where I did my undergrad in pulp and paper technology, now doesn't offer that as a degree anymore. It's now simply chemical engineering, just to show how the industry continues to change and shrink.
Here is a question. I'm going to put it on the screen.
What pulp was used for tea bag paper? It's fine but strong. Today's tea bag paper, and of course, the company I worked for the last 17 years, makes 90% of the world's tea bag paper. Today, it's made from fibers that come out of Philippines and Indonesia, particular very lightweight fiber that is related to the banana plant. Back in the tea bag filter days in the paper mill in Wheeling, they were using predominantly flax. In fact, flax is still used by one or two small tea bag producers in the United States, one of which is in New England.
Cool. Here's another question. I'll put it up.
Was the paper industry in West Virginia sustainable to support the industry? That's a great question. I mean, obviously, during the heyday of Wheeling's paper industry, it was predominantly rags and straw that we used. The advent of pulping, using wood pulp, didn't really begin until the 1880s, and in fact, didn't really grow until the early 1900s. And in fact, you could not pulp a hardwood tree mechanically or using chemicals quite easily until the 1920s. So the wood industry is one of the reasons why the industry shifted in West Virginia to places like Luke, Maryland, and of course across the river in Piedmont, or in places like Fairmont, down farther south in West Virginia, towards the Charleston area, etc. Because trees. So once wood pulp came in, yeah, there were lots of trees, plenty of them in West Virginia. In fact, again, the company I work for, PH Glassblatter, has a major wood yard in Washington, West Virginia, which is over by Parkersburg. And it's located in that region, of course, because of the absolute abundance of trees in West Virginia and Kentucky, Southern Ohio. So great question. But yeah, you know, to put a paper mill in Wheeling today wouldn't work because, of course, the lack of trees in that region.
Okay, here's another one, Scott.
Handmade papermaking, yeah, great question. Yeah, I mean, obviously, handmade papermaking has continued since, of course, the early development of Siloon way back when. It's now a specialty. It's done obviously for stationery or for other kinds of decorative papers. There are certainly a number of craftsmen throughout the United States that are still hand producing. There are actually 2 or 3 small paper mills as well that are doing industrial quantities of hand-produced papers, if you will, as well. There's one out in California. There's another one in the upstate New York as well, if I recall correctly. But yeah, handmade paper is still there. Funny story, though, when I told my parents I was going to college to study paper making, my mom and dad were initially upset because they're like, you're really good in science and math. Why in the world would you want to hand make paper? You know, are you going to make that basket weaving and do poetry and play the guitar? You know, what are you going to do in college? And I'm like, no, modern paper making is all science and engineering. So no, I'm not going to basket weave and I'm not hand making paper.
There you go. All right. Let's see. Any more questions? This is your big chance. All right. I don't see anything, Scott. I'm going to thank you for a great program.
No problem.
All right. And next week, we will have the Zafiro Trio, Pittsburgh classical musicians, and some poetry students from the University of Pittsburgh who wrote poems to go along with the pieces you will hear. That'll be on June 30th. Thanks again, Scott. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.